Hi, I'm Tom Berenz, and you're watching For Art's Sake. Hi, my name's Tom Berenz, and I'm here at Parkland College, really showing a recent body of work. The current work is sort of an investigation about my interest in contemporary landscape painting, and it really deals with sort of a personal investigation of me looking inward to try to understand sort of a deeper meaning of the way that I navigate through life. A lot of my work has to deal and do with piles or floating information. So some people might come into the show and think about airplane crashes, exploding picnic tables, exploding picnics, and a lot of other things. And what that's really doing is I'm thinking about multiple events that have sort of occurred in my past and things that I'm thinking about presently and into the future. This painting is dealing with a pile, sort of a personal flotation device or life preserver or life saver pile that is on a beach. I'm really interested in sort of referencing a lake that I grew up on. So there's reference to some sort of lake or beach, and I'm thinking about how I can really abstract these forms, so the viewer can really project into the paintings and come up with their own narrative, because these narratives and sort of the events in the paintings are extremely personal, but I'm not that interested in talking about my personal story or sharing it. I'm much more interested in kind of having it be open-ended, where the viewer can project into the painting and come up with their own meaning and have a relationship with it. But at the same time, I'm interested in controlling certain aspects of it, of setting up the sort of the figure-ground relationship within the landscape, and referencing this pile of flotation devices. I was also thinking about inflatable beach rafts like sharks and turtles and things with this painting, and this painting is really talking about sort of the fleeting moment of how the lake is in a drought, and how it's dealing with childhood memory, and how these are sort of distant places and distant things. I'm also interested in what a flotation device can actually mean metaphorically and symbolically, besides the obvious of floating on water, and how that can relate to one's life. The painting next to it is sort of a study of this. This is my comfort zone as far as the size of paintings. I've been making paintings like this for, I would say, 5 years, 6 years, at that scale. And I've been trying to make smaller paintings. So this painting is titled Save Me. It's a study of that, but really what it was is this painting was a study of that painting, rather than thinking about for scale of how the larger painting, traditionally painters will make a smaller painting, think about it big, but I was interested in how I'd make a smaller painting in response to that. And they're similar. I kind of really like how they're next to each other. When I've shown these side by side in the past, there's sort of always one over in the corner, kind of to disguise that or tuck it away. But I really like the relationship of them next to each other. You can see some similar forms and a lot of similar moves in the painting. So I think it's an interesting relationship to think about how I painted that painting in response to that. And there's multiple reasons of that thinking. Of one, the most pragmatic way to think about it is these paintings are really hard to ship, and they're expensive to ship, and I can put this in my Honda Civic. But two, I've always been interested in a challenge, of setting up a challenge for myself, of trying to get a painting like this at this size to work. In my studio, I'm constantly working on a small painting, and I probably produce 20 small paintings. Well, I call this small, it's 36 by 36 a year, and maybe 2 or 3 leave the studio. So for me, it's this really this large challenge of thinking about how, you know, a mark like this can work on a scale like that, and how the units and the scale change so much that it's this great challenge. So for me, it's trying to understand this space and the way to make a mark, and how I can really construct a painting at this size when this is the size that's really easy. So this painting is called Cake Flight. It's a really good example within the show of kind of multiple things happening within one painting. So I know some students have pointed out there's different airplane elements, different cake elements. There's reference to trees, birch trees, other type of trees, different patterning. But what I'm thinking about this work is really thinking about sort of some sort of emotional tumbler of me thinking about different experiences that have happened both in the past and in the present. So what I'm doing is I'm thinking about a lot of different events and I guess events and concerns, and I'm putting them in this sort of blender, if you will, and I'm sort of letting anything happen within the painting. There's also another cake painting in the show that was before this painting. So a lot of the paintings will have sort of a deconstruction over the course of a show. It starts with, you know, the birthday cake painting, and then I deconstruct that and I bring it into another painting. The work deals with certain anxieties and fears in a lot of different ways, and I'm always a little bit hesitant on really talking about sort of the deeper narratives within the work. Again, allowing and letting the viewer project into the painting. But I guess I had a sort of a really scary plane flight once, and ever since I don't fly. So I'm really, really afraid of flying. So I'm thinking about how sort of that anxiety can interact with some pretty rough childhood memories within a painting. And when I say rough childhood memory, it's really about me and my brother's relationship, of how he was a little bit older and we really battled it out. Sort of a side note of sometimes there's these blood, or well, there's these drips that are red, but I've been trying to think about how to make a painting about chopping my brother's finger off. It was an accident. I actually did chop his finger off with an axe. And there's a painting that's not in the show that I made that was in response to that. But I'm kind of constantly thinking about those sort of moments, those brotherly sort of love moments that might have happened. But it got sewn back on, and he's all right. And it was an accident. But I want to talk a little bit about just the technical things within the work. I think a lot of people look at this and sort of kind of think about, well, how did I do that? So what I'll do here is I'll put sort of a larger piece of tape down, and with an X-Acto knife I'll cut out, pull the tape, and then paint it in almost like a screen print, multiple coats depending on the paint. There's also these larger gestural moves. So I have some house painting brushes that will just sort of sit around. I like them to get sort of worn out, so I have less control. But the way the paintings are built up the paintings will start with these really large gestural moves and become they're very soft and very gestural. And as the painting builds, it gets sharper and sort of more contrast, and I'm really then pushing and pulling and figuring out the right color combinations. So all of these, so I use a lot of tape. I'm interested in sort of a taped off zone and then making a mark and letting it be. So it's like this, containing this sort of really gestural move. I also use a lot of water. In this painting, it's a little bit hard to see, but what I'll do is I'll set something up, let it dry, and then I'll spray it down with water. So in my studio, I have this sort of drainage system where all of the water will run off. And most of these shapes have been painted 3, 4, 5 times to figure them out. So it might read as, oh, that just yellow, and then I move on to the next thing, to the next thing. But if you start really investigating these shapes, you can see where there's this sort of undercolor, or there's just some history that's occurring there. Also spray paint. So there's different moments of spray paint that are occurring within a painting to more gradual, realistic blending. I'm really interested in that range of moves that can happen in one painting. I'm interested in expanding that vocabulary and really trying to think about how spray paint, these gestural forms, these softer moves, can work with this really hard, rigid sort of shape. With the shapes, I'm sort of thinking about something with each shape. We discussed the flotation devices over here earlier, and how the color will sort of take you there. So I'll rely on sort of 2 things sometimes with making a shape. 1, the shape and the placement, and then 2, the color will take the viewer to a certain place. If you think about this shape, I think most people would say, all right, it reads like a sun. But the moment you take that out of that location and put it here, it's no longer a sun. Maybe it's a lemon. So I use those 2 tropes to get the viewer to go in a certain direction. And then with the spray paint, a lot of times the spray paint is sometimes it's the final move to think about breaking that rigid, sort of hard edge painting down. What's tricky about painting with a lot of tape is it does feel so sort of stiff, static, and a little bit too geometric for my liking. So I use different sort of moves, drips, squirts, spray paint, other drips, just different really mark making tools to break that rigidity down. I painted a successful painting of my father, and it's not in the show, but it was a sort of melted snowman. And for years I've been thinking about how to make a painting about my mother. And what I've been thinking about is sort of how in the future, how I'll look back on the present. My mother is still alive and healthy, but every day I sort of fear losing her, losing really anyone close to me. So my mom spends a lot of time in the garden. She's this great gardener, and she has this just sort of beautiful gardens all throughout the yard. And so I've been thinking about a symbol or a stand-in for her. And that's when these flowers start coming up within the paintings in the show. It's really a symbol of her. So again, you start seeing these plane crashes. So it's, I'm not really thinking about an actual plane crash hitting a garden or a bouquet of flowers. I'm more thinking about sort of the anxiety of something or the fragility of something crashing into something that I think is stable. So I've been really interested in thinking about a painting that's about my mother, even though that I think a lot of people would never see that or understand that or think that is about my mom. But I've also been interested in sort of the history of painting and how some of these paintings relate to that. There's this tradition of birch paintings or birch trees in paintings that I've been interested in dealing with. Also, there's this very rich tradition of still life flower paintings. So I think about that as a challenge. I think some of the hardest things to paint are the things that have been painted so often. So I've been thinking about flowers both in terms of sort of the art historical canon and how I can sort of incorporate that in my work. flowers, I think, have this sort of really interesting meaning and understanding of how, you know, we give flowers to celebrate, say, one's wedding or birthday or some sort of celebratory ceremony. But we also lay flowers by a loved one's grave. So I'm interested in how sort of enigmatic that a flower in some of these symbols can be. Also, there's this picnic motif that's occurring, and this is the first painting that I've ever painted that had the picnic cloth in it, and I think this is actually the oldest painting in the show. So you can start seeing the evolution of different patterns, but really with the start of this painting. This painting is called Watermelon Picnic, and it's about a car crash crashing into a really romantic picnic. And this was about the time I got engaged, and it was me sort of struggling with this idea of sort of marriage, the anxieties that come along with that. These paintings have sort of a deep personal meaning, but at the same time, I'm not expecting anyone to think about this painting as it's about my wife and our relationship. But it's about a moment. It could be this perfect moment that you want to cherish, but then something interferes and interjects with that situation of, again, thinking about sort of the fragility of a moment, the fleeting of a moment, and really thinking about time and space and place within these paintings. So there's these sort of recognizable moments that this really reads like a watermelon, but then I'm thinking about how I can break that down where other things also reference that. So I'm setting up the watermelon both here and probably here to read like a watermelon to the viewer, but then I'm sort of making a certain color decision and a certain mark decision that will also reference that. So I'm interested in playing with sort of realism and sort of pure abstraction and really breaking that down in quite a few different ways. This is a good example of that spraying that I was talking about earlier. So this texture is just very thin layers of acrylic paint, letting it set up and then spraying it and then letting it drop. The majority of these paintings are all acrylic. That is for a few different reasons, but the main reason is because I move very fast through a painting. Sometimes these paintings will set up quite fast, and I need to be able to get into certain zones. So I'm really interested in the dry time of acrylic, but then I'm interested in other moments of thinking about an enamel spray paint that might take a little bit longer for the texture, but then other sort of tubed, straight out of the tube paint to add a different dimension, to think about the viewer's interaction and really to think about the surface quality of the painting. I think online, my paintings read very flat and very very graphic, as if they were, as if maybe they're like a vector image. But then in the flesh, you really start understanding, oh, that's a 4-inch house painting brush pull and a mark, and they're very painterly, and that's something I'm really interested in investigating and exploring. It's interesting to see these two paintings next to each other because I almost feel like this is the winter painting and this is sort of the end of summer painting. This one is another good example to think about how it relates to a previous painting, and thinking about how it really does start reading as these personal flotation devices and life preservers. And because I think it's very obvious in how that reads as sort of a beach pile of objects that sit around on one's sand, maybe at the end of a summer. And then this one would be sort of the turning of how, at the end of winter, things start thawing out, and that's sort of what's underneath it. I have these, I'm interested in snowmen, and over the years, there's been different zones within paintings that are sort of deconstructed or broken down snowmen. And what that is I think my father he's sort of the stand-in as a snowman. So this is my father. So I've been thinking a lot about sort of these floating debris or floating information and how it can relate to events or people in my life. Very much interested in children's collage. I think there's nothing better than going to like a art contest of children's work. And I've been thinking about how some of my shapes and how I'm referencing collage. This reads very much like a piece of paper stuck on. Within the process of painting this, what I will do is cut out a shape, paint it, and then stick it on to see if it's the right form, the right color, etc. Also very interested in children's coloring books, and I've been thinking a lot about connect the dots. So this painting is really about a clothesline of these hanging things that have fallen. And instead of showing the line, what I've done is I've created connect the dot moments for the eye or for the viewer to really maybe just imagine how they would connect the dots themselves. So I'm trying to reference children's collage, sort of collage in art history. And really thinking about sort of the sort of childhood development when thinking about coloring. Dealing with my interest of abstraction, I'm constantly thinking about sort of how a zone or these shapes read and respond and work together. Both thinking holistically about how the whole painting works together, but at the same time, I'm very much interested in sort of that to that to that to that. And that's the thing that really excites me in my studio, because after sort of the composition, the forms, the piles are set up, then really what it is trying to adjust that color to work with that and then work within the entire painting. So for me, that's when I actually think painting is fun. Is when things are set up and then I can make those subtle small adjustments. It's interesting to think about how painting is or isn't fun. I think a lot of people might imagine this being this really sort of fun activity, but my days in my studio are really hard. I spend a lot of time being hard on myself and leaving with a lot of frustration after 8 to 10 hour day in the studio. Most of the time when I just have a few hours in there, I kind of leave okay, but after a long day in the studio, there's always pure frustration, and then I go home and I can't sleep because all I can think about is the work. So when I'm on break from teaching, I always think that's sort of when the real work starts with my creative work, but it means long days in the studios. It means sort of long nights thinking about what I did and what I want to do. So this is the birthday cake painting that I was referencing earlier in the talk. It's called Fifth Year Birthday Cake, or Fifth Birthday Cake. And if you start counting, there's actually 5 candles. But this is really thinking about sort of my childhood experience. I think there's a lot of humor in my work, and I'm not sure if people pick up on that, but like any comedian, I think there's always these deeper, darker layers. And so a lot of my palette decisions are sort of light, airy, fun, almost childlike. But if you peel back a few layers, there's this sort of darker, multiple sort of darker layers. So thinking about sort of a wrecked, broken down birthday cake. So it can mean like a bad birthday, it can mean a bad year, it can mean a lot of different things. And I'm really open and interested in how one can come up with their own narratives within the paintings. Something that I've been really interested in is playing with the edge of the painting and that spatial development of thinking about how a flat red field can read and push back into space, but then how something on the edge of the painting can really just flatten that space out. So I'm constantly sort of, I guess, doing and playing tricks with the viewer of setting them up into certain spaces and then flattening those spaces back out. So certain zones will sort of pull out in front of other zones, both in terms of their color, but then I'm interested in thinking about, well, this reads like a really realistic cast shadow, but this has nothing to do with, really nothing to do with foreshortening or perspective. It's at an angle, but that is the same size as that. So I'm constantly thinking about how to sort of play tricks with the viewer. I'm sometimes interested in thinking about things that are deepest in space. Maybe this feels pretty deep in space in terms of its subtlety, but that has the most texture on the painting. So how can something that is deep in space be actually the closest thing visually or physically to the viewer? Marks like this, what I'll do is on my palette, I'll just sort of set that up and just go over and over and over again with a large house painting brush, and then make that pull, again, making that pull multiple times. Everything is normally painted multiple times, so it's not like I paint the background and then paint the things in the midground and paint building up. A lot of times, again, it's these large gestures to figure out the location of things and then painting over and over and over again. The last painting is again another earlier painting. This is dealing really closely with that sort of plane crash that we were talking about. This is about these narratives that I come up with are kind of ridiculous, and in some ways I can't even wrap my head around them, and I don't know even what they mean, but I'm interested in depicting them. So this is about a plane crash in a woods, but the parachute jumpers also sort of fell into that same location. So they're sort of on a fun sort of outing of parachuting, and they also sort of their parachute didn't implode. So I'm thinking about how they both fell into that same location. There's a lot of references to sort of the woods in my paintings. And I referenced and mentioned the lake earlier and how a lot of these paintings deal with that landscape. But I spent a lot of time growing up in playing and getting lost in the woods. I had the great opportunity to always live on a lake in the summer. So there'd be, in the front end of the cottage, it would be a lake, and on the back end, it'd be this woods. And I'm interested in what the forest and what a lake can mean, sort of conceptually, and I've always been interested in what a home or a house is. And for me, the closest thing to what a home or a house is the forest, is the lake, sort of is being in nature. So the paintings are about sort of this stability in this sort of comfort area, but then being disrupted by this very this very vulnerable thing that sort of breaks that security or that comfort zone down. So that's what I've also been thinking about a lot. So it's interesting to think about these different deeper spaces. This is a good example of thinking about how this texture really starts reading like foliage and deep sort of wood space, but then this one becomes extremely flat in its development. So I go from one painting to the next, thinking about different textures of all right, I need to have a certain texture, or I need to set up a different sort of illusionistic, deeper space. So every painting starts with a challenge and with an idea, and I try to follow that.